Okay, all of us are familiar with the... Yeah, that's a nice idea. All of us are familiar with the phenomenon of stress, and I believe that most of you are probably slightly more relaxed right now than I am. My heart is pumping, and I'm quite nervous. Now, stress, especially if it becomes chronic, can have very detrimental effects, both to our bodies and to our psyches. And meditation has become one of our main means in our society to deal with stress. Particularly mindfulness meditation is extremely popular these days. And I teach this at universities internationally, but it's also taught in hospitals, prisons, from boardrooms to the world's most successful sports clubs. And usually how meditation or mindfulness meditation works is by focusing one's attention on an object, such as the natural flow of our breath, right? Obviously, things are slightly more complicated if we look at them in detail, because what meditation does is it awakens us to a reality that usually eludes us. The fact that we have an internal voice, which kind of creates the stress for us. So in my situation right here, for example, it is not only that my heart is pumping like crazy, it's also that I'm having thoughts like, is it really right that I have no slides for this part of my presentation? Is my zipper open? Where do I get the next cappuccino? And so in a way, my mind is jumping around like a monkey from one branch to the next on a tree. Zipper, meditation, presentation, cappuccino, pizza. Always go to the pizza at the end. This is my mind. So in a way, what meditation does is it disattends to these discursive thoughts that keep running through our minds. And it disrupts this identification with the monkey mind. We slow down, we get present-centered, and the monkey, in a way, relaxes. And so we can do this together right now, just for 1 second, maybe. All of us just close our eyes, take a deep breath, and just feel our bodies in this very moment. Now, this kind of felt good to me, and probably to you too, because you got a little reprieve here, but don't worry. I will not be sitting down for the next 10 minutes. I'm here to introduce a new paradigm of meditation research. And there we go. So I am trained as a historian of Indo-Tibetan religions, which means that I study very old texts that were written in Sanskrit and in Tibetan languages that contain panoply of different meditation practices, usually connected with conceptions of the body, cosmology, philosophy, myth, ritual, many, many other things. And so me and my colleagues are trying to figure out how to bring order into this really vast ocean of knowledge. And so what my research project does, it divides the practices I find in these texts into 3 categories, each one of which engages our monkey mind in a slightly different way. כן, יותר נעים, תודה.
רגע, just a moment.
מוכנים? יופי. אז, so, the first set of techniques I studied in detail during my PhD research. These practices are usually marked by a very open, spacious, and kind of unstructured approach to reality. Here we find meditators like here, sitting on top of mountains, on the slopes of mountains, and they gaze into the blue skies for extended periods of time. Or they even build specific huts that do not allow for any kind of penetration of light, and they stare into the darkness for weeks at a time. And what happens is that as they do this, they start to perceive certain things. Visions start to come up quite naturally and automatically. And so I call these practices participant spontaneous forms of meditation, because it's as if by looking at reality in an unstructured way, reality itself grips us or it manifests to us in an automatic way. And we start to appreciate things that we haven't seen before. This too can be done right now, right here, right? I mean, all of us can just let our gazes kind of fly across the panorama of this room, and you'll see stuff you haven't seen before. You haven't paid attention to before. I saw 2 or 3 very beautiful things. I'm not even going to conceptualize it in words. I kind of maintain the freshness in my own experience. But the point is that In a way, I believe that these types of techniques and this endless possibility and potential for vision is deeply connected to our passions. Passions, too, cannot be created. We're usually gripped by our interests. And so, in a way, me standing here today is the result of me following my monkey mind and becoming a speaker in front of you, sharing my knowledge with you guys. Actually, last night I was walking through the streets of Tel Aviv, and I remember back when I was a young boy, they asked me, Flavio, what are you going to become, or what do you want to be when you grow up? And I kept saying, I want to become a monkey scientist in Madagascar. And for me, that somehow I thought, well, this guy was smarter than I thought. Anyway, now, I come to the second set of techniques. These practices are quite different in nature, and I would say that they're the most classically tantric techniques of meditation. They usually consist out of two stages. In a first stage, the meditators visualize themselves and they identify with the deity. They do this over and over again, taking on the various characteristics of the god, like here, for example, in this mandala. And then, in a second stage, they take on this identity, they embody it, and they act it out, and they perform various physical practices. Some of them where they sit in the cold weather and they generate a type of inner heat. Others where they perform sexual practices together with a consort. And so these techniques I define as predictive executive forms of meditation. Because here we're no longer participating in this kind of natural unfolding of reality, but much rather we're setting ourselves up to take on a specific identity, we apply it, and then we test it in reality. And so, in a way, this too can be related to my experience standing in front of you right now. I remember when I first started out lecturing, I had a course of 140 students at the University of Virginia before I even finished the PhD. And I was so nervous that I kind of crafted myself this Flavio lecturer personality, and I was like, fact 1, fact 2, fact 3. It was like a reading or a speaking Wikipedia entry. There was hardly any presence in that, the poor students. But it was over time, as I was practicing and repeating and kind of getting comfortable with this persona that I've crafted, that I was able to integrate form and freedom, structure and spontaneity, this public persona, and a more intimate sense of self, which I hope is flowing through this talk today. And so the third set of techniques that I would like to talk about, they're the least understood amongst experts of Indo-Tibetan religions even, because they're utterly bizarre. Here we have yogis that go into villages and they pretend to be crazy people. Or they imitate the behavior of wild animals. Or they smack each other over the head even. And usually these practices end in a collapse, in a sense of loss of consciousness. And so I call these practices experimental disruptive forms of meditation, because it seems like they want to precipitate the moment where our predictive schemas, our normal, ordinary perception of reality falls away, it breaks off. And so in a way we could say, well, these things look quite strange, but they actually reveal a very deep truth about Buddhism. Namely, that our existence on earth is not marked by safety and relaxation, but much rather by suffering, pain, and repeated moments of crisis.
Flavio, you know, I agree with you in a lot of things, but in this regard, I have to say I don't agree. I also read a lot about Buddhism, and you want to say that Buddhism is connected to pain and suffering? I'm not sure.
Okay. Thank you so much. This is Nadine, my good friend. This disruptive moment was organized. She's very, very sweet. Thank you so much, really. Here, let's calm down. Everything is fine. We're all good. So this was very good. I loved it. Okay, so she was a perfect candidate for this because she's a social psychologist studying peace and conflict resolution. So I thought she would be the least likely to come up here and smack me over the head. And so obviously what Nadine is saying is entirely true. What we're having with Buddhism is not only do they throw us into a pit of despair and nihilism, but they pull us back out. The idea is that Buddhism is a noble path, and it's a noble path because we actively and courageously face this unpredictability of life. Crisis is an opportunity to create meaning, to give meaning to our lives. And so we see this even ourselves. We learn and we grow and we become wise when we're pushed outside of our comfort zones. Sometimes it's necessary to experiment and to risk looking foolish in order for us to learn a new skill or to improve a skill that we already have, such as you as listeners, me as speaker, and us as humans more generally. And so here I come full circle. I'm going to close off the talk by returning to the idea of stress. What we've learned in this talk is that certain meditation practices deal with stress by another disruption. I love it. I just got a little more enlightened. Certain meditation practices deal with stress by actively engaging it. And so, in light of the challenges that we're facing as a civilization now, but also in decades to come, pandemics, climate change, et cetera, we do not know what is going to come, right? I believe that sitting in our rooms, closing our eyes, calming down our minds might not be the most effective way. This is why I encourage all of you to actively and openly engage your monkey minds, find your passions, set yourself really ambitious goals, go out there and test these skills that you acquire in reality, and fundamentally embrace this unpredictability of life with a sense of adventure. Thank you for the time and the attention. Thank you. Yes, we can take questions. I'm happy to facilitate. Okay. Please, Balthasar. The mask is coming off. It's a beautiful movement. Okay.
Good. So I really enjoyed it. My question would be, you said you studied these texts, right?
Do you need the mic? Yeah. Sorry.
Efshar.
Yes, for the, yeah. Okay.
Okay, so you said you studied these texts to understand, to classify these different practices of meditation. My question would be, are you also interested in what's going on in the brain? I mean, from a cognitive aspect, is that also part of your research? Is it something you kind of match the discussion or like research on literature with cognitive phenomenon? So that would be my question.
That's a very good question. So you're saying yes, of course. I think in light of the Azrieli focus in general, right, I am really interested in interdisciplinary work. Now, whether this means actually neuroscientific brain scans of people performing these practices, that is very difficult to do. This is one of the reasons why we have this bias for mindfulness meditation, because it's much easier to scan someone's brain if they're just sitting there focusing their thought rather than going out and performing wild exercises, right? It's much more difficult to get an fMRI scan of this than of the other. But obviously the cognitive sciences are a very philosophically diverse and very self-conscious field at this point. And so there is a lot of reflection about how the human mind works, how it's distributed through the body, how it's embodied, how it's inactive in a way, right? We call this the 4E cognition. And so there, I believe, is a really nice interface to work cognitive science together with research on meditation. Yes.
Cool, thanks.
Please.
Jonathan, just introduce yourself.
Jonathan, yes.
I'm Jonathan.
Hi, Jonathan.
Jonathan Cadmon, Faculty Fellow, Neuroscience.
University. So, how do you define meditation? I mean, is it just the intention? What's the limit between doing meditation and acting crazy? Elon Musk meditating now?
You got the right question, right? I think you're pointing to the point of what I am, in a way, I think you're pointing to the issue. I don't know whether I can answer the question. I do not know whether I can respond in a clear way. I think there is a sense that these techniques are very intentional. I think awareness, intention are super important. But I do believe that the boundary may be between what we ordinarily do. I mean, if you go to a baseball game in the US and you sit there for 5 hours, we need to ask ourselves, what are we doing here? Right? I mean, there can be such practices, boredom, for example. Boredom is underestimated. I believe boredom reveals a lot of things about us and about our reality that we haven't thought about before. And so it might be an interesting phenomenon to look at. Obviously, in these texts, all of this is intentional. This is planned, so you could say it's a planned boredom, a planned spontaneity, a planned disruption. And so there is a certain intention to it. But I would definitely agree with you that the definition of meditation, in a way, needs to be widened, for sure, and that's a risk. I agree.
The intention has to be to meditate or just to distract?
No, the intention has to be to perform various exercises that have different, right? The disruptive element is only one, right? But like learning a new skill, for example, right? I mean, if someone is playing the piano and learning how to play the piano, it's a very meditative process. It can be interpreted as a meditative process, right? So anyway, that's how I would put it, yeah. But I agree with you entirely that that in a way the boundary of meditation becomes fuzzier as you start expanding your horizon and looking at what is out there, right? But we need to start somewhere, so. Please, Moran.
Hey, Flavio. So you talked about three. I'm Moran, like a painter from the Hebrew University. I study the chemical origins of life. And my question for you is, so you talked about 3 different practices of meditation. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you ever came across, a situation or some practices where there was a combination of different practices, so like acting crazy and think you're a god,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes. So it's a very good question, and it's totally true that in a way the distinction I was saying, it's a vast ocean of knowledge, and there's a panoply of practices, and I'm trying to bring order into them by kind of systematically organizing them. But in reality, things are much more messy. You're absolutely right. Some of these practices, for example, are preliminary, like the crazy acting practices are preliminaries to the one looking into the sky. So there is a connection between these, and sometimes they happen in a sequence. Yes. Please.
Reuven, I'm a postdoc studying physics in the Technion. So my question is this. I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong, that when these practices were developed, stress was at the very least not as a big a deal as it is nowadays, because it's kind of a symptom of modern life. So when these practices were developed, what was their motivation for developing and perfecting these practices? And then assuming that it doesn't have much to do with pressure or stress, how is it for nowadays for handling stress?
That's a good question too. So you're saying that stress in a way is a modern phenomenon and these practices were developed earlier. Yeah, I think you're right that the term stress and the focus on stress in modern society is actually, in a way, it's an invented phenomenon, you could say. But at the same time, Buddhism does have this fundamental belief that something is not right. Something just doesn't jive here in reality. There is just something is off, right? So they might have used a different term for it. They call it the first truth, which is suffering. Something is not quite right. And so these practices were definitely there to help with that suffering and overcome it. Obviously, there is a soteriological goal of becoming enlightened, etc., right? But this is throughout all of Buddhism. Existence is painful. And it's painful because we have certain expectations that do not correspond to reality. And I would say that's a fundamental truth about stress, too. It's a deadline, and you see it approach, you can't meet it. That's suffering.
Last question.
Please. Arseni.
Hi.
I love the message.
So I'm Arseni Finkelstein from Tel Aviv University. I'm a neuroscientist. And I'm wondering, you mentioned that these 3 different practices are intermixed but in terms of chronological accounts of their appearance, is there any order? And the motivation for the question is whether we as humans are more perhaps predisposed for either acting out or closing into our own internal thought process.
That's a very beautiful, very, very, very thoughtful question, actually. So there's 2 things. One is temperament. I think Buddhism has this from early on, that there is a sense that each individual is slightly different and we have different characters, and so there is different practices that are suitable for individuals. That's the thing that Buddhism recognizes. Another element is that historically speaking, it's a mess. It's a big mess. There's many people working historically on these texts. That's what I'm doing. So basically, the first set of practices, these participant ones, where they look into the sky, I'm trying to figure out where they're from. Because all of a sudden, in like the 9th, 10th century, these tantras appear. And they say we're from India. But there is nothing in India like this, ever. And so it's a Tibetan invention. And so in the book that I'm finishing right now, I make an argument that I say it's a trauma response. It's in a way of handling trauma through these practices in a way, right? It's a cultural form of response to trauma, you could say. And so you could do this with many different practices, but it's just a lot of work. And I think organizing it this way it's a different approach, but it brings order into a big mess in a way, right? Into a big ocean of knowledge, I called it, more positively speaking. But really, Tantra is very messy. It just is. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.